Hello, everybody. I'm just going to sort out how to dance around my handbag without dropping my microphone. None of us were expecting to do it in the round today, so sorry about that. You might want to move, because I can't guarantee that I'll remember to turn around. All right, so I am the global automation leader for Arup, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why we thought we needed one of those. I'm going to talk in pretty general terms, because I think that the way that digital transformation affects the industry is different depending on where it is that you sit. But I think that it is interesting for you, or perhaps useful for you to know that I come, of course, from an engineering firm where we're thinking about the design part of this. So, where to start? I think we all know by now that Industry 4.0, or the new age of data, is changing the way that each of us work. And the changes are driven by, pretty obviously, vast increases in available data, which is due to the lower costs of sensors, ubiquitous wireless, maybe in this room, perhaps not, and other Internet of Things innovations. It also depends on the collection and collation of that data in structured ways, the increases in processing power that allow more questions to be asked of that data, and for more correlations and causations and other relationships to be established. There are changes in the availability of information and our expectations around how we interact with the world. And there are advances in machine learning techniques that have vastly improved image recognition, speech recognition, to the point that machines are nearly as good as humans and better in some situations. None of this should be a surprise to you. I'm really just saying this to kind of get the stage under my feet. And I'm sure that every one of you has realized by now that, if you open up your phone and you search your phone's image bank for beer, you'll get all the pictures of beer. And if you search for food, you'll get all the pictures of food. And that's not because you labeled them. It's because somewhere deep in the creepiness of the internet, somebody has figured out what those things are and can pull them out and bring them back to you. It gets even worse when Facebook recognizes your friends in photos without you actually having to say who you spent the weekend with. But what does that really mean for us in the property industry? And in the property industry, I'm sort of taking the very broadest view that it's people who imagine, plan, design, construct, operate, and occupy buildings, because it's, that's most of us, most of the time, most of the day. And it's clear by now that we're seeing quite a lot of changes in the structure of the industry as different organizations start to offer different ranges of services. And so I'm just going to give you some examples of things that I think have already changed that have come straight from digital, although they don't necessarily look like digital transformation. So my first example is with lift companies, and this is sort of part of a broader trend where, as a consultant, I'm sensitive to people saying I can offer advice because I think maybe you're in my space. And almost everybody is at this point saying, oh, I'm going to offer some advice. So from being a difficult, low-margin, high-risk area, it's suddenly become the place everybody wants to be. But if we start with something like a lift company, because it's a pretty easy-to-grasp example, many of those manufacturers are now really heavily instrumenting their equipment so that they know how much the lifts are being used, when maintenance might be needed. And it's clear how this helps, right? A lift contract often includes for supply and maintenance. And the instrumentation may show that some components are under-engineered, others are way more robust than they need to be, and so far so good. All of this is about the design, the supply, and the operation of lifts. But if you have heavily instrumented your lift, you can also gather data about how the lift is used, what kind of wait times are expected, whether they run full or empty, whether there are particular floors, whether lifts always get held. And all of this begins to show the shape of the morning, lunchtime, and evening rush, which allows lift companies to become vertical transportation consultants, which is a role that might previously have been held by other companies. And this is a pretty typical story. It's providers of all sorts of items of equipment, lifts, heating and cooling plant, electrical systems, can all start to move from being equipment suppliers and operators to providing consulting services and recommending their equipment. It's possible to imagine a not too distant future where a major corporation that perhaps provides things in lots of aspects of the industry, could make a variety of equipment and provide all the advice that's needed to put together all of the major equipment for a building. And the missing pieces that can't come from the equipment data are the engineering for the rest of the systems, typically the networks, and the sort of some piece about non-partisan kind of high-level advice. Maybe the best piece of equipment is actually something that's made by somebody else. How do you make sure that the client is getting the right thing? In other words, if you've got the data from the equipment that you run, it's possible to come up with an answer to the exam question that we get to with mechanical engineering, mechanical and electrical engineering for buildings. And that question is, how do you provide a comfortable, safe, and internal environment at the lowest possible energy use at a price the customer can afford. And that manufacturers can now do this because they have the data to show it. And there's nothing wrong with any of this. I think everybody is always kind of trying to expand the scope of services that they offer. Consultants are always trying to get into sort of post-occupancy advice. Vendors are always trying to get into pre-occupancy advice. Everybody is always moving a little bit one way or the other, but the availability of the data is making that far more possible. Of course, the challenge to this is that it begins to challenge some established practices around risk and risk sharing and the risk management between owners and contractors and consultants and vendors. And it's pretty difficult to understand how risk is apportioned in a construction and design and operation contract. And if you suddenly start giving vendors the opportunity to design the equipment, are they actually ready to take the design risk that's associated with it? And are the owners ready to take the risk if the vendors are not? How do you figure out what those changes actually are? My second example has a slightly different starting point. When I first started work, which only proves how old I am, the design industry everybody did everything on vellum with a razor blade and an ink pen. And over the last 30 years, the industry has transferred almost all production from hand drawings to models constructed using software. And that software is basically made by one or two, or maybe three or four software providers. And those firms are also beginning to provide more and more services. Many of them are in the cloud. Many of them are providing great convenience in delivering routine calculations. And that's leading to massive data transfer from consultant models to vendor tools. And there are some implications of this for the industry. Firstly, software vendors know what kinds of calculations are being done using their tools, how often and by whom. And as a result, they will eventually, because they're much bigger than any individual consultant, be able to provide benchmark data against a much larger range of situations than anyone else. Secondly, there's a great deal of pressure to do automatic calculations in the models, and the software vendors have made it convenient to do it in the model, and the result of that is that actually you tend to give away the calculation methodology when you give away the model. And it's possible to imagine a not too distant future, again, where software vendors control all production work. That may also not be a bad thing, but it does begin to change the way that risk is carried across the construction process, because the terms of a software license agreement are always that it's up to you how you use it, and there's no responsibility to the software vendor. But if they're also providing benchmarking and the guts of the calculation tools, will this kind of division of responsibility remain acceptable to the industry as a whole? A third example is in the sort of changing means of production. It's really obvious to say that when you hand a model over from the design team to the construction team, there's some value loss, because you hand something over, and inevitably the things that you knew don't all get handed over. So back in the dark ages, when drawings were done on vellum, and there were not all that many of them and changes were hard to make, you could construct a building off about 20% of the drawings that you need now. And the difference between the old 20% of the drawings that you need now and the drawings that we now produce are all to do with the level of information that's provided. So although the construction industry is continually slammed for not having improved productivity, the amount of stuff that we're producing for roughly the same fees per project is enormously larger. And what's basically happening is there's a transfer of risk between the contractor and the consultant, in that the consultant is now expected, and it's a good thing, to provide more information on the drawings and more coordination and more level. And so there's another change in sort of risk profile. So a couple of ways that people have reacted to that. One is to push to design build, which keeps all the risk in one place, and more or less is as is. And the other is to go traditional design bid build, but expect different things to happen from different people in the industry. So this might not feel like a digital disruption, but I think that it is, because it is the sharing of models and the increasing level of detail that is really there to manage the inevitable loss of knowledge and value when information is passed from one contract to the other. So my last example of sort of disruptions that have already happened come from the other end of the market. I live in New York, accent notwithstanding, and the We Company is by far the biggest renter of real estate in the entire city. And that is brand new. 10 years ago, they didn't exist. 5 years ago, they hired half my team. Now they own all, the largest part of real estate. And what is happening here? And I think what we're seeing is that they've grown from providing co-working space to acting as facilities providers for big corporations. And then they've also worked to develop construction and design. And they've kept a really careful eye on all the data that's being developed in putting the projects together and the data that arises from how the projects are used. And they've become expert at understanding how modern offices are used, the most appropriate size and number of conference rooms, how to make possible hot desking and other practices that would be really hard to make work in corporate offices. And this level of vertical integration, you will do everything. We're a one-stop shop for your facilities needs, entirely disrupts the industry along similar lines to the way that Henry Ford's car manufacturing disrupted or actually invented that industry. And if we look across other industries like the automotive, what we see is the pendulum swinging from entirely vertically integrated to everything outsourced. So let's bring some of it back in because actually that thing that we needed wasn't available on Tuesday morning and that slowed us down for an entire month. There's sort of this question about where's reliability, where are savings, where do you need competitiveness, where do you want safety and quality to be absolutely paramount, where actually should that risk fall within the industry. And the construction industry has never quite gone through this cycle. But we should not mistake that the We Company and others like it, Katerra, not the same model, but it's a similar model, has been made entirely possible by the potential of data to realize improved value and the massive amount of investment money that is chasing that value. Though both we and Katerra are very heavily funded by SoftBank. Neither of them make a great deal of money, but that doesn't mean that they won't in the end. So what do we as incumbents in the industry need to do? And of course, we're different kinds of incumbents. I know that there are in the room contractors and consultants and property managers and software vendors and equipment manufacturers. So all the people that I've said are busy pushing their elbows out. We're all here. So what is it that we need to do? What are the things that we should be doing to make sure that we're prepared for that disruption, that we are in the best possible shape for when the industry suddenly turns itself on our head, that we still are able to provide value to the construction industry, or more importantly, to the society that has that construction industry within it. So what is the digital transformation that we should embark on that will help us adapt to the coming changes? Much of what is written about digital transformation is not readily transferable to design, and I spent about a year reading it and thinking, why doesn't this make any sense? Most of the really good examples of companies that didn't start as technology and digital firms who have managed digital transformation are companies with very highly transactional relationships with their customers, and where each transaction has a very high degree of similarity and the decision trees are straightforward. So you can imagine a bank or somebody who sells tickets there's thousands and thousands of very, very similar interactions with clients, which spit off a bunch of data, which you can then analyze and figure out whether you need to provide a different service. And a lot of the early examples of people who've been through digital transformation are in those very highly transactional industries. The people who did start as technology companies often started with an idea about connecting two or more groups of people across a platform who otherwise would have had difficulty finding each other. So MySpace was an early one. It was music and fans. A later one is Uber, taxi drivers and taxi customers. And all of them have been sort of driven once they started by collecting and managing data about those transactions and then figuring out how to monetize that data. It's not immediately obvious where design and construction fits into that. And so I think that as an industry, we've been quite slow to sort of say, well, what does this mean for us? And how do we enter the real digital world? What are the things where it can make a difference? So one of the things I thought I would talk about, so I'm going to, is about the barriers to change within firms. And this is based on a piece of research that we did. And it was really about why aren't we moving to digital immediately? Why isn't it a sort of a natural transition? Why isn't it that it's just happening to us? What are the things we have to do to get there? And we came up with really 4 things that are barriers. They're in the way of automation, they're in the way of digital transformation, they're in the way of changing your mindset event, which is actually what I think is at the core of digital transformation. So unpacking these 4 things, which are culture, leadership, awareness, and skill, the first one is culture. And this one inevitably cuts both ways. There will be things within every firm's culture, say an enthusiasm for innovation in our case, that tend to promote change, and there will be things that cause people to resist. These might be as simple as not wanting to be automated out of a job. There is no way to shoot yourself in the foot better as an automation leader than say, if you automated that, you wouldn't have a job next week. Wouldn't that be a great thing for you to do? But the more likely thing is that it's complex because the culture is complex because the current set of solutions might be believed to be perfect. And this is the one that I think is most specific to different firms. There will be something in your culture that promotes digital transformation and something in your culture that will get in the way, and they may be the same thing. The next one is leadership. Most firms have no trouble getting senior leaders to identify the threats and challenges and opportunities associated with digital transformation. But it's much, much more difficult to identify the actions needed to make transformation happen. And once you get into the need to change, you find yourself either in the territory of the square-wheeled cart. The cartoon is a square-wheeled cart with people on the top saying, I'm too busy, and somebody running behind with round wheels. And that kind of is a real strong picture to me of what digital transformation can look like if you can't get the leadership right. The other one, the other sort of cartoon that's in my head is of somebody standing at the front of the room and asking everybody if they want to change, and everybody puts their hand up, and then you ask them if they want to change themselves, and everybody's hands are deep in their pockets being sat upon, because actually digital transformation is about individual and personal change. You have to be ready for it for yourself. And the reason why I think that you can get leadership to do things is because they know that all they have to do is say, yes, let's head off in this direction over here, and they don't actually necessarily have to do anything except set the direction. The hard work of making it happen happens a little bit lower. And so it's the middle-level leadership that is actually much more difficult because they're the people who are struggling to make the money, look after the clients, deliver the work. In our context, in other contexts, they're being very carefully held to a set of objectives. So that's the next one is leadership. The next one is around awareness. We're mostly, all of us, good users of our phones, right? We use them to play Candy Crush, we use them to text, we use them to answer email. We become very quickly aware of all of the things that our phone can do that minimize our inconvenience or that save us from even a few seconds of boredom. But most people are much, much less comfortable with exploring the OneDrive app or something equally dull, and are impatient with the need to download the app to get access to a conference like today, or are bored by the need to spend time trawling through Google Play to find out what's out there that might be possible for you to use. And the same is absolutely true in our work. We find it hard to imagine what might be possible with digital until we have seen it, and many of us are really quite reluctant to explore. A lot of us work in what Harvard calls the greedy professions. They'll always take one more hour of your time if you let them. And if you're working in a greedy profession, your work is never done. So finding time within your work to actually explore something else and figure out the next level of awareness is pretty difficult. So getting to the point of awareness, again, it's you personally need to change, and one of the things you need to do is raise awareness. And this is, in some ways, a generational thing. Pretty easy with the under 20s, although sometimes they're the under 30s, although sometimes they're incredibly focused. Quite difficult with the 30s to 40s. Almost impossible with the 40s to 50s because they're really too busy. And the 50s to 60s are all saying, well, you know, if I just hold my breath, I'll be able to retire before this actually hits me. Anyway, the fourth one is about skill. There are a whole new set of skills that haven't been imagined when I was in college. And it's not just one thing. At the beginning of our digital transformation, we had a tendency to think that if we hired a coder and put them in the corner, that would work for digital transformation. It clearly doesn't, because you have to have, if you're building software, if you're building an automation, which is essentially software, if you're building a tool for a client, you have to be able to design the software architecture, you have to develop the user requirements, you have to make sure that you invent a user interface that's pleasurable to use, you have to make sure that you've got a product manager so that you don't expand the problem every 5 minutes until you can't solve it anymore. There are all sorts of things that you have to do to get skill. So what is it that we have to do as professionals in order to grow those skills during the course of our career? What is it that we should actually learn? Should we all learn Python or C# on the weekend, or should we do something else? Should we think about lean? Should we get an exposure to design thinking? Should we think about workflow mapping? What are the kinds of things that you might want to do in digital that would actually begin to move your own skill forward? So those are the sort of 4 internal barriers, I think, in any firm. And any path to digital transformation has to address those barriers, as well as the one that we missed when we did that piece of work, which is finding the money to get it done. But none of this is actually enough unless you know what you're trying to do. I must have said something interesting, because the audience has doubled. Anyway, it's my very strong opinion that digital transformation has to be in the service of something. And I think this is the piece that we sometimes miss. The benefits have to be clear because change is pretty hard. So if those are the internal barriers, what are the external barriers? And I think that the biggest sort of external barrier is around approach. And if you look around the industry and you think about digital transformation, you tend to see sort of two approaches. One of them is that somebody says, okay, I'm going to bring leadership to this. I'm going to review my entire business and all the processes in it, and I'm going to see if there are any opportunities to solve those problems using a data-driven or a digital approach. It's really hard to get up the energy to do that kind of enterprise-wide exercise because it needs a lot of leadership time, because there are opportunities for digital everywhere, and because the scale quickly becomes scary. The amount of money that you would have to put in order to make that work becomes very difficult. So in many cases, it's much easier to focus on a particular aspect of the business, perhaps one where where frustration is running high or where there are particularly high areas of risk. Things like improving safety or productivity or materials management, information management, or reducing the amount of waste through digital means. So you might start picking off the ones for which there are tools available, like extranet tools used to manage documentation in construction, as a way of both raising digital awareness, that was one of my internal barriers, and skill level, and getting a start on having people being able to imagine the next big step. And that next big step might be a further development or a completely new idea. For example, there's a tool that uses image recognition techniques to see whether people on sites are wearing high-vis jackets and hard hats. And then you can see this, and it sends a little alarm to whoever's in the room, and they go out and find this person who's not wearing their high-vis jacket and their hard hat, and throws them off-site or otherwise provides discipline. So you can get sort of surveillance in different ways. She says I'm nearly done. I am nearly done, I promise. So there are tools that you might not have even imagined. Who knew that you could improve safety with an image recognition technique? The second approach is to identify technologies and see if they have applications, and we see this quite a lot. People buy robotics process automation software, and then they expect it to solve every problem that they've ever had in their industry, and then they are disappointed. We also see that people get really excited about VR or AR, and they want to use it, but actually it tends to be what in engineering we call a solution without a problem. And these things are always a little bit dangerous because it's what are you going to do this for? You put investment into it, it doesn't have to return because it's not necessarily solving something that's top of mind. So neither of those approaches is terribly satisfactory as a way of making change at pace and scale, which of course is what we want to do. The first one has too much scale, and the second one is just too scattered. And they're both subject to actually what is sort of the core problem of digital transformation, which is that nobody knows where we're going. At the beginning, I talked about the kinds of changes that had happened as a result of digital to the structure of the industry. And if you'd started and said, will digital restructure the whole industry, you might not have said yes, or you might have said yes, but you might not have predicted that those were the ways that it was going to go. So it's too difficult to imagine the end point because digital working can be so disruptive, and it can be so disruptive in so many places, and it is changing so quickly, and the changes it brings challenge the organization of the whole industry. So to sum up, I have actually said three things, although that may not be totally clear. Firstly, digital change is already driving industry change in ways that are not obviously digital. There's lots of reapportionment of risk, reapportionment of workload and expertise. Secondly, meeting the challenges of moving into digital needs vision and leadership, imagination and upskilling, and making this happen is, in any organization, is actually pretty hard because it needs everybody to change, not just to want change. And thirdly, if you want to do full digital transformation, you have to have a strategic approach. And what that strategic approach will be different by firm, depending on whether the focus of the firm is on something physical or on something advisory. And that is that for now.